Chapter 19. We had purposely left high sagebrush for protection from the wind on the outside of the west fence of the home garden and yard. One day, as Daddy passed the garden on his way up from irrigating, he saw something interesting. Hurrying to the house, he called to me, "Come quick, old lady, if you want to see something good." He took me by the hand and hurried me down to the garden fence. Peering through the sagebrush, we saw Albert, 6, and Martha, 4, standing beside a newly dug grave of a half-buried doll. They were holding between them a small Montgomery Ward sales catalog, which they had salvaged from our outhouse. They were using it for a songbook and conducting a funeral. They were singing "Hi Diddle Diddle" and "Sweet Betsy from Pike" for funeral songs, their little faces struck with grief. Daddy and I watched a while and then quietly slipped away. Later, the children dug up the broken doll and brought it to me to mend. The children had a special burying ground on a grassy plot near a spring some distance from the house. Here they conducted funerals for all their badly broken dolls and pets and buried them. Mostly there were dogs, cats, and lambs, and sometimes a little bird which had fallen out of a tree and been killed. Each grave was marked with an Indian relic they had scouted the country to find. They held these tombstones as something sacred, and would no more remove one from a grave than they would have removed a marker from a human grave. Years later, when they were all grown and gone, we had sold the ranch, we made a visit to the old homestead, and much to their sorrow and consternation, we found that the tombstones had all been removed. Most of the riding after cattle was done during the summer when the boys were away working, and since the girls were out of school, they helped me. The PF cowboys continued to help us with the branding, and the girls and I went along to help all we could. My job was doing the cooking, for though I was quite a hand with pots and pans, I wasn't much help with a rope and branding iron. There was a big picket corral at the top of Tool Mountain where we branded the spring and summer calves. One summer we went up to brand and found the corrals burned down. This meant we had to brand in the open, which necessitated the help of all hands, even the cook, in holding and branding. Usually they sent one of the boys with me back to the camp to help me with the Dutch oven, but this time they couldn't spare anyone, and I had to go back alone to get dinner for the bunch. The boys had moved the camp that morning, putting all provisions on the ground and erecting a tent over them. I had brought along fresh raspberries to make them a pie, and I was down on my knees in the tent with my back to the tent opening, patting a pie dough into a pan. I was wearing Levi's that day instead of the usual riding skirt. Suddenly I was rudely surprised. The tent flap was flung open and someone applied a boot to the seat of my pants and said, "Hey there, you damned old son of a bitch, is dinner ready?" Looking around, I said, "Well, just about." And there stood a young cowboy kid about 18 years old. He was completely surprised and embarrassed to see me. Grabbed off his big cowboy hat and stammered, "Forgive me, lady, for God's sake, forgive me. I didn't know there was a woman within 20 miles of here. Please forgive me." "Just forget it, kid. Can you run a Dutch oven? If so, I think God might have sent you. Get out there and dig a trench big enough for 4 ovens, and it'll help me a lot." He dug the trench, gathered wood, and built a fire in it, and when the wood burned down to a bed of coals, he shoveled them all out. I was ready with my 4 ovens. One oven was filled with sage hen, one with biscuits, one with vegetables, and the last with my special berry pie. We set the ovens in the hot trench and covered them with coals. Then we sat on the hillside and talked while they baked. We talked about everything. Every few minutes he'd break out with, "Please don't tell the other boys about me. They'd never quit ragging me about it." I promised again and again not to tell, but he kept making the same request and remained uneasy and fidgety. At last, the bunch came into view over the rim rocks and headed down toward the camp for dinner. There were 7 cowboys and my 3 girls. I had to go into the tent for some last-minute preparations, and when I returned, the young cowboy was just stepping into his saddle. He tipped his big hat and waved goodbye to me. He rode down the canyon, and I never saw him again. He didn't have faith enough in women to trust me not to squeal on him. I kept his secret for several years. When one day I was talking to my son-in-law, who had been a cowboy boss at the time, I told him of my funny experience, and he told me that the kid was the son of an old friend of his, and was to have met him at the cow camp on that appointed day. Evidently he had mistaken me and my Levi's for the boss. He'd often wondered why the kid hadn't ever shown up. The dance at Fish Springs was the first dance away from home ever attended by our girls. It was the forerunner of many that followed. Girls were scarce in our part of the country. A Spanish family named Geraldo were our neighbors, living 12 miles away over in Dry Valley. There were 4 boys and an adorable girl named Adelaide, who was the age of my daughter, Jessie. She was a typical Spanish type with dark skin, large brown eyes, and 2 long, heavy braids of black hair, and she was the jolliest, happiest person I'd ever met. Her happiness grew with her. Her philosophy of life has always been, if you can't fix a thing, skip it. How much happier we would all be if we can make that philosophy work in our own lives. Adelaide and my 2 older girls were great companions, and many a horseback ride they had across that 12-mile stretch, and many are the dances we've had with myself, my bunch, Adelaide, and the Dry Valley school teacher constituting the female attendants. We had to travel a good many miles to attend some of the neighboring dances. There was the Duck Lake School 25 miles away over the line in California, Bird Flat School, also in California, 45 miles away, Doyle, 28 miles away, and our best dances at Flanagan, 25 miles away at the junction of the Western and Pacific Railroads. There, the whole population of the different school districts would meet for an evening's fun. One old neighbor played the violin. He had a handlebar mustache, and Alice was always waiting for it to get tangled in his fiddle strings. Some of the cowboys brought their guitars, and Edson played the accordion. We all brought a cake and coffee and had a midnight supper, but there was never any charge, and we always danced till daylight. At daylight, our group would go home with the cowboys to the camp for breakfast, and we always stayed to watch the boys mount their horses and start out on their day's ride. Many a good bucking horse show we've witnessed in those early morning hours. It was nearly always a 2-day trip to attend one of these dances, even after we got our Model T Ford, for the trips to Flanagan and Duck Lake or Fish Springs necessitated a trip over Fish Springs Hill, very steep grade, which the Ford would not pull. We would drive as far as the car would go, and then the boys would meet us there. We drained the radiator in a milk can brought along for the purpose. Then the cowboys would drive us with the buckboard and the mules to wherever the dance was to be held, then drive us back to the car the next morning after breakfast. Then they'd help us build a sagebrush fire to melt the ice in the milk can, get the car started, and see us on our way. It was some work to attend those dances, but we always came home feeling we'd had a wonderful time. Besides being fun, it was handy and interesting way of keeping track of our stray cattle. People attended the parties from all parts of the range, and we always kept track of each other's strays. It was always great fun for our teachers to go to the country dances, where everyone danced for the sheer joy of it. In some way, we always kept up on the latest popular dances. When I was a girl, we danced the waltz, the schottische, the square dance, and of course the sedate old Varsuvia. Now they were dancing the foxtrot, the turkey trot, one-step, or rag. I thought the new wiggly dances were terrible, but I tried the one-step and found it lots of fun. We had great plans for one dance that never materialized. We had an old schoolmom who had just come out from Reno to teach at our school. The cowboy boss, bow-legged Ed, came over and announced that he wanted to give a dance down at Goshi's, where there was a big dining room. He said he would invite everyone on his coming ride to the different parts of the range. We set a date, and Ed made verbal invitations. The teacher sent home for a party dress, which turned out to be a beautiful blue evening gown. Our children were simply goggle-eyed over it, for it was the first formal dress they'd ever seen. They told Ed about the beautiful dress and showed it to him on his next visit to our place. Ed didn't say a word, but in the next day or two he rode around that 70-mile trip and uninvited all the people he had formally invited. When I asked him what made him do such a thing, he said, "I knew there wasn't any of the cowboys that'd want to dance with a schoolmom in a silk evening gown, not when we all come in Levi's." Not having the dance was the greatest disappointment to our little teacher, but she soon learned, when in Rome, do as the Romans. In the fall of 1918, the World War was in full swing, and it was nearly impossible to get help. Fortunately for us, we had reared our own help, but a young couple who homesteaded near us, Mr. and Mrs. Griffin, and their 2-year-old baby, could get no one to help them. They were living in a tent on their property and had cleared and fenced 5 acres of good land and planted it in potatoes. Then Mr. Griffin went away to work, leaving his wife Minnie to tend the potatoes. This she did faithfully with a garden hoe for her only implement. Water was scarce and had to be turned on often on new rows of potatoes. I saw her every night all summer coming down the hill with her lantern at 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. to turn the water. In the fall, when the potatoes had been harvested, it presented quite a problem. Mr. Griffin didn't like to quit his job to come home and harvest the crop. He had each weekend off, but instead of digging potatoes on the weekends, he would go into town and try to hire help. He spent several weekends that way, but it was impossible to get help. Soon it got to be November, and winter was almost upon us. I began to worry about that potato crop. I thought of all the hard work Minnie had done in raising it. It would be a shame to see her lose them. Then a generous thought struck. Here we were, snug for the winter with all our crops harvested. Daddy was feeling pretty well, and Edson home every Saturday and Sunday. Why not volunteer our help? With our team, plow, and horses, we could help dig all their crops, even the school teacher. I would like to be able to write an ode to country teachers. I never had one with me that wasn't willing to join wholeheartedly in any of my strange projects, anything from cremating a bull to helping the neighbors with their potatoes. One Saturday when Mr. Griffin came home, the 9 of us, Daddy and I, the teacher, and the 6 children, took up the plow and the horse and went to work. We made short work of digging those potatoes. To make it a little more interesting, I offered a prize of $5 to the one finding the largest potato. I found it myself that last day we worked. It was the largest I ever saw, weighing 2 pounds. Picking it up, I squealed with delight and called, "Isn't this fun?" Jessie, who was picking alongside me, said, "Mama, you can think the queerest things are fun. My back aches, my eyes are full of dirt, my fingers are sore. I intend to stay with this job till it's finished, but it isn't a bit of fun." We finished digging the potatoes in 2 days, buried them in a pit that had been previously dug. What a lucky thing for the Griffins that we did. That night a storm blew up and our real winter set in. Next spring potatoes sold for $12 per 100 pounds, and the Griffins were able to make quite a profit on their crop.
And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm.